Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate. And we're talking about this story in the New York Times that outlines how John Roberts acted in a way that I think is surprising for a lot of commentators in response to the Trump immunity case and the case involving January 6th and one other. Mark, we had talked just a little bit before this. There's sort of two stories here. One is the sort of the actual story and what it reveals about John Roberts. And the other is, how did they get this story and what's going on at the court that had them have these documents, which are incredibly revealing. And I'm talking about like emails between judges, it appears. And it's fascinating. And I want to get to that second, but I do think that's almost like almost a bigger story in some respects. But let's start with this. John Roberts, he just calls balls and strikes, right? I mean, that was his whole thing.
Well, it's what he told the Senate. It has not been his style as Chief Justice, at least over the last few years. And according to this report, he now is very MAGA-pilled. He's essentially in the tank for Trump in these major Trump cases. And he didn't have to be like dragged along by his colleagues to the right. No, he played the commanding role in shaping 3 decisions just last term that all came out for Trump in about as great a way as Trump could have possibly wanted. A trio of cases, which now the New York Times reports and CNN had already suggested, he sort of lassoed as his own and guided to an outcome that I think is really pretty dangerous for constitutional democracy. I'm sorry if that seems like an exaggeration. But when the liberals accused Roberts of putting Trump on a throne, making him a king above law, I mean, I think that's pretty clearly correct. And if Trump wins in November, he is going to be the first president in history who will be freed from the constitutional restraints that we assume presidents had to adhere to because of John Roberts and his machinations behind the scenes to make this trio of cases just a total victory for Trump and Trumpism.
And this comes as a big surprise. And what you and Dahlia Lithwick wrote a piece about it, and part of it was a mea culpa. It's not like you could have really changed the trajectory of John Roberts' career, but you guys said and largely this was the sort of like a mainstream view of John Roberts, and maybe he has changed in some way, or maybe you see that you got a 6-3 advantage on the court. There now you don't need those other 3. Now you don't need to function in that way. It's almost like we got the money in the bag. We're out of the bank. Let's now we're getting in the getaway car. But let's start with I don't know. What do you find? Which one of these stories is most egregious? Because one of the things that's an element of this is the way that there were attempts by the liberal minority on the court in a couple of these cases to sort of say, like, we're willing to compromise and almost give John Roberts a way of mitigating the absolutism of his rulings, and he just completely rejected them.
Yeah, and I think where that is most egregious is in the immunity case in Trump versus United States, where the Supreme Court granted Donald Trump absolute immunity for official acts, quote unquote, that he took while in Oval Office that are somehow within the realm of his core constitutional duties, which is defined very broadly. And we now know that during the drafting of that decision, the liberal justices came to John Roberts with an olive branch and said, we want to compromise with you on this decision. We don't want this to be another 6-3 decision with a conservative supermajority, just going as far as it wants. We have a vested interest in working out some kind of middle ground with you, at least on a few points. And John Roberts froze out the liberal justices. He did not even try to make any sort of compromise or find any middle ground at any point. And, I think that's the story that made Dahlia and me issue this kind of mea culpa, because up until even last term, John Roberts Roberts had evinced some desire to chart a middle course where one was available and where he could do it without betraying some of his core principles. You know, he's definitely a member of the conservative legal movement. He believes in a strong president, at least a strong Republican president. But, you know, we had thought that if there was a real meaningful effort by the liberals to give him most of what he wanted, but avoid a badly split partisan decision, that at least sometimes he would take that option. And now we know he's done doing that. He's finished working with the other side, crossing the aisle, so to speak, to try to find any kind of sensible middle ground. He wants to power the court to new conservative extremes. And I think that a key factor here is what you just mentioned, that this is now a 6-3 court, right? There's no more sort of like 5-4 split decisions where the liberals are on one side and conservatives on the other, and Roberts might try to work out some compromise to prevent it from looking so badly divided on political grounds. Now he is working with the flank of the court to his right, the Trump appointees and Thomas and Alito, and he is in some ways trying to out-MAGA them. He is trying to recapture his position as leader of the court. I think he felt like he lost in a few cases over the last few years where the 5 justices to his right powered the court to a extremely conservative decision, most obviously in Dobbs, where the chief was not ready to overrule Roe v. Wade. And I think the chief just decided, you know what, this is me losing, and losing sucks. Losing is for suckers. So I'm just going to refashion myself as the MAGA chief. And that is the story of the immunity case that was going on behind the scenes when people like Dahlia and I were saying, maybe there's some hope. We're confident that John Roberts doesn't want to break constitutional democracy. No, it turns out that he was eager to, from the moment this case hit their docket, we now know from a confidential memo, he was lobbying the justices behind the scenes well before oral arguments that they needed to take this case and give Trump pretty much everything he wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. He really short-circuited. I mean, he basically said, this is interesting. I mean, you know, we don't have this type of insight into cases in a general sense, so it's hard to know how atypical this was. But he took this case and almost from the get-go basically said, here are the parameters in which we're going to decide this. Like, there's, you know, he created a baseline of like, we're definitely, you know, going to town with this stuff. And that's basically it. What is also interesting, and because, you know, part of, at least in my experience in interviewing commentators about the court and court watchers, is that there's always been this sense that John Roberts is so keenly aware of the legacy of the court and whatnot, which I don't think that this article disproves, but I do think it comes down to, like, you can be keenly aware of the legacy of the court and understand what it's going to look like if the votes are 5-4, you know, as people are looking 40 years in the future. But if it's 6-3, you have a lot more protection. And I think that's like what's happened here. I mean, you know, this was always latent in him, but he was just waiting for the right opportunity, and the right opportunity is there. What I was also struck by was what, you know, within the Times piece, a couple of like top experts on the court said was they've never, ever heard of this. He took a case from Alito that specifically was about January 6th, and he took it just coincidentally, I guess, 4 days after that article in the Times about Martha Alito, and her, and the you know, was this when the tapes came out too, where, like, you know, she's talking about Vergonia. We actually have a Vergonia T-shirt. It's no longer for sale. We sold out. But tell us about that, because that is also bizarre.
So I want to get to that, but first I just want to briefly respond to your first insight, which is really important here. I think that I have maybe even come on your show in the past and suggested that John Roberts cared about the court's institutional legitimacy as a good in itself.
I don't know if we've ever had anybody who comments on the court not say something to that effect.
And what I think we've learned is that he doesn't care about the institution in itself, like as a good in itself. He cares about how much he can get away with before he breaks the court, loses that legitimacy, and thereby loses his power, right? Because we all know the Supreme Court does not have any actual power, can't send an army to go enforce its decisions, right? It relies on the country believing in its integrity and choosing to follow its decisions. And so I think that's a subtle distinction in a lot of ways, but an important one. He really just gauges public opinion to the extent that it tells him how far he can push the court rightward. At least that's what he does nowadays. And part of the shock of this reporting from the New York Times is that rather than try to gather like legitimate public opinion and get a sense of where the country is, he's increasingly in an echo chamber listening to sycophants like Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, who immediately showered him with praise when he circulated a draft of his presidential immunity decision, told him it was, so brilliant and remarkable and implied it would stand the test of time. And so according to the Times, he really thought, John Roberts really thought that the public would celebrate this decision, that this would be embraced as, a great victory for the presidency, not Donald Trump or any other individual, but for the constitutional office of the presidency. He was so wrong. This was a reviled decision from the moment it dropped, including among many conservative commentators who are rightly afraid of how a corrupt Democrat could weaponize this decision to leverage their power in the Oval Office, to punish enemies, to violate civil liberties, to try to subvert a free and fair election. And Roberts just did not see that coming. And I think that shows how isolated
Let
he
me
is.
just read this one graph from the Times, because I really was struck by this, because this is not the type of things you read in the Times about John Roberts. In his writings on the immunity case, the Chief Justice seemed confident that his arguments would soar above politics, persuade the public, and stand the test of time. His opinion cited, quote, enduring principles, quoted Alexander Hamilton's endorsement of a vigorous presidency, and asserted it would be a mistake to dwell too much on Trump's actions. Quote, in a case like this one, focusing on transient results may have profound consequences for the separation of powers and for the future of our republic, he wrote. Our perspective must be more far-sighted, end quote. But the public response to the decision announced in July on the final day of the term was nothing like what his lofty phrases seemed to anticipate. I mean, they're basically saying, like, this guy's, however you want to phrase it, drinking the Kool-Aid, smelling his own, farts, whatever it is. And
I think that a premise of that decision, which is also a premise of the other two January 6 decisions that we're about to talk about, is that Donald Trump does not present a unique threat to constitutional democracy, that Donald Trump is not a heightened peril or threat or bomb aimed at self-governance in America and freedom in America. That Donald Trump is just another president who's controversial. Some people love him, some people hate him, but he's not anything special or different from what's come 200 years in the past. And so the court needs to treat him just the same as anybody else. And I think that's disastrously misguided. I think it's remarkable that Dick Cheney sees why that's wrong, but John Roberts does not.
But isn't that even irrelevant? Because the next president could be, and from my perspective, the next president certainly theoretically could be worse. I mean, than Donald Trump. I mean, the problem is that the real problem is that we just don't know how far anybody's going to go. I mean, the funny thing is that, like, to watch Roberts' behavior change with a 6-3 majority is the identical sort of like analogy to what does a Donald Trump or whomever, for that matter, do when they basically enter into office and know they more or less can't really get in trouble for anything they do as president. I mean, that, to me, seems to be the most problematic part about at least the ruling and Roberts jumping in there. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.